basically, I'm just an ordinary person, a student who got a public school education, public in the sense government school education. And I was born in a small town in Karnataka, in Shimoga, and I grew up in Bangalore. I was lucky to go to, and I also went to school in Kolar, another small district headquarters in Karnataka. And my father was a high school teacher and later became a high school headmaster and a deputy education officer. And I was lucky to attend a wonderful university in Bangalore called Central College. And then after that, I was lucky once again to attend, to get a job as a research assistant and as a faculty member at the Central Institute of English and Foreign Languages in Hyderabad, which is now called English and Foreign Language University. And after that, I went to the University of Illinois in Urbana, where I did my PhD, as Roliji just gave in her very generous introduction. And then since 1980, I have been working here, again at a public university. It's a state university, the State University of New York, and Stony Brook is 50 miles away from New York City. And so it's not too far, and most people do visit New York. And so when you come to America, you are welcome to come and visit us. Here is a personal invitation. And here at the university, we have been teaching, my wife and I, for 41 years. And I'm still teaching, and I hope to be teaching as long as I can. So that is the reason I mentioned all this is because I want to emphasize that I had a very ordinary background and upbringing. And there was no, I was not a person of privilege, in other words. Okay. And so my experiences are probably the kinds of things that would be open to almost everybody. And so it would be interesting to see how we can relate our personal upbringing and ordinary teachers that we all had, and how these ordinary teachers became extraordinary teachers and extraordinary influences. And that's what I would like to emphasize in this session. So let me start, and it will be a kind of the method that I will use can be described as stream of consciousness, because I will start connecting one experience with another, one idea with another, and one value with another. And I will try to make it anecdotal, grounding everything that I have to say in specific experiences, and at each point drawing some lessons in terms of what values they represent. So let me start in the traditional Indian way. Most of you are probably familiar with the practice, with the wonderful practice that Indians have. When an Indian scholar, traditional Indian scholar, I'm talking about people who studied the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Puranas and the Itihasas, Mahabharata and all of that stuff. When a traditional, and it could be in any language, not just Sanskrit, when a traditional Indian scholar starts a lecture or a talk or a discourse, as we call it, in Kannada we call it upanyas, but I know that in Hindi, upanyas has a different meaning. It means novel. It is customary to start by saying Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha means I salute or I pay my respects to my teachers, as you know. And I think that's a wonderful practice. Unfortunately, we don't have that in the Western societies. And that's a wonderful acknowledgement of the fact that we are what we are because of the teachers that we happen to have. We are molded by our teachers. And Gurubhyo Namaha is interestingly ambiguous. It can mean my salutations to all my teachers, many teachers, more than one. It can also mean a way of paying respect to your teacher, because you always talk about them in the plural number and not singular. And so I would also like to start by saying Shri Gurubhyo Namaha to my teachers. And who are my teachers? And I would like to interpret the term teacher in a very broad way. Because in Kannada, we have a wonderful, the Kannada is my mother tongue. It's also Professor Shastri's, one of his mother tongues. We have a wonderful proverb or an adage. It says, Vandakshara kalisidatam gurum. A person who taught even a single syllable is a teacher. So in other words, the description of teachership is a very broad one, and it acknowledges many types of teachers, even not only the people with the PhD and the people whom you learn from at university research centers, but it could be just a friend. It could be a sadhu that you come across, or it could be your mother or father. And so I would like to interpret the word teacher in many different ways. And I was lucky to come across many different types of teachers. And I learned something or the other from all of them. And in fact, when I reflect upon my career, I can see where I got this from and where I got that from and so on, although I may not acknowledge it at every stage, but I never forget it. So who are my teachers? I would like to start with my mother. She was the best teacher I had, actually. And she was not a very highly educated woman. She only had 5th grade education, schooling. But she was perhaps one of the greatest scholars in Indian philosophy and things like that, because she taught herself. And she read everything through books and by attending religious lectures and things like that in temples and things like that. And so although she could not speak English, she could understand a little. And my father was a teacher of English, and he had a wonderful education at the University of Mysore, where some of the legendary teachers such as Professor Rollo, McIntosh, and McAlpine, and people like that at the Maharaja College and at the University of Mysore. And he had 2 degrees, a Bachelor of Arts in English, Geography, and Sanskrit, and also a Bachelor of Teaching. In those days, they used to call it BT. Now they call it BEd, I believe. And I learned a lot from my mother, simply following her as a little kid of 4 years or 5 years, as she went cooking every evening from the kitchen to the pantry and pantry to the kitchen 50 times, and I would hold on to her sari and she would tell me stories. She would tell me stories from the epics, Mahabharata and the Ramayana and so on, and lots of Puranas. For example, the story of Dhruva, who was given a stepson's treatment by his stepmother, and he could have been depressed, and he was depressed, a 5-year-old boy. And then his mother says, his real biological mother says, well, what can you do? Don't put your trust in human beings, but rather trust God. Go pray to God. And he does. And Vishnu actually shows up and touches his cheek with his Shankha, Shankha, Chakra, Gada, Padma. Those are the 4 things that Vishnu has in his hands. And suddenly there is an enlightenment. And his own father realizes his mistake and treats him properly, and so on and so forth. I'm just telling you this one little story because it's just a random thing that I remember. But there were lots and lots of stories. The story of Prahalada, for example, a child who stood up to his father, who was a kind of a tyrant for the whole world, but who had the integrity to say, no, I do not recognize you as the greatest force in the world, as he wanted him to. And so he was able to assert himself. So once again, our Mahabharata and the Puranas and all that are full of wonderful stories that can be models for us. And so I learned a lot about Indian mythology. We call it mythology, but for us, they are very real, those stories. The story of Rama and Hanuman. Hanuman, what a magnificent character. The most colorful character, the most interesting character in world literature. And everything that he did has things that are of relevant to today. For example, how do you talk to somebody? Hanuman is one of the wisest people in the world, right? And he goes to Lanka, and he locates Sita, and she is sitting there, surrounded by all these demonesses who are guarding her. And he has to talk to her. He has a message to convey from Rama. So the question is, how should I talk to her? In the sense, what language to use? Of course, Sanskrit, because the whole epic is in Sanskrit, Valmiki Ramayana. But what kind of Sanskrit? Should I use a very fancy Sanskrit, learned Sanskrit? Because Hanuman was a very, very learned man. Because the moment Rama sees Hanuman in the Valmiki Ramayana, he says, hey, this is a very sophisticated monkey. He's not just a monkey. Because he speaks a grammatically pure version of Sanskrit, he says. Vyakarana Pandita. Okay? So he's not just ordinary monkey. So he was very learned, and of course he knew all about diplomacy. He knew, for example, he brought about a reconciliation between Vali and Sugriva and all that. So Hanuman is capable of speaking, knows a lot. So he has to decide which dialect of Sanskrit to choose. And that's a problem that all Indians have even today. Every time we need to talk to somebody, we have to decide. Should we speak in English? Should we speak in Hindi? Should we speak in our regional language or minority languages, tribal languages, or which dialect of which language we should use, right? All of those problems are problems that we have. And this is a problem that is encountered in a very realistic fashion by Hanuman. As he is sitting there on the tree, thinking about how to approach Sita, right? And things like that. our Mahabharata and our epics are full of stories of that kind. And I learned a lot of these things simply by listening to my mother, going back and forth. And then they used to attend temples and discourses and so on. And so there I learned a lot of Indian mythology and literature and an interest in this literature. That's the most important thing. It's not the actual content that's important, but an attitude toward learning that is created by somebody who ignites this interest in you, right? And so my mother and father, for example, when we went to bed, my father used to tell us stories, bedtime stories. And his stories ranged from all over the world. There were a lot of stories like Prahlada that I just mentioned. But there were also lots of stories from Greek mythology, Atlas and Hercules and things like that. And also Shakespearean stories, Macbeth, Hamlet, Othello, and things like that. Of course, I was very lucky that way, that I got a cosmopolitan upbringing without knowing that it is a cosmopolitan thing. So for us, in other words, there was no barrier between Indian and Western, between English and Sanskrit, between Sanskrit and Kannada, and between Kannada and Hindi, and all of those things. In other words, later on in my master's, I read a beautiful article by T.S. Eliot, who is considered to be one of the most influential critics in English and in cultural studies. This article he wrote in exactly 100 years ago. In 1921, it was published. It was called Tradition and Individual Talent. And in that, he talks about how a contemporary poet, that is a poet writing in 1921, in Europe, whether it is in Spanish or Italian or English, has to face a problem. The real problem is how to escape the influence of all the great writers who went before you. That is, escape the influence of Homer, of Aeschylus, of Sophocles, of Dante, of Milton, of Shakespeare, of Wordsworth, and all of those things, and to find your own voice. And so he says, at any given point of time when somebody is writing, the entire tradition of European literature, from Homer all the way up to the Victorian times and Georgian times in 1921, is simultaneously present. It's as though everybody is saying, in the great grammarian Bhartrihari, the 5th century grammarian, one of the greatest grammarians that the world has seen, a philosopher of language. He says, when you are, and Patanjali also says the same thing in his Mahabharata, commentary on Panini's great grammar. He says, when you are writing or saying something, all the words are coming to you saying, take me, take me, take me, use me. Because you have to make a decision as to which word to use, right? Similarly, T.S. Eliot says, at any given point of time when a poet is trying to write or a critic is trying to write, the entire tradition is simultaneously present. Notice this word is extremely important, I think. Simultaneously present. That is, you don't think of Homer as somebody who belongs to the past, 2,700 years ago or whatever. And T.S. Eliot as somebody, or W.B. Yeats as somebody who belongs to our time. But rather, they are both present at the same time. Similarly, in our case, when we are using stories to tell our children, whether it is European stories, whether it is Indian stories, old Sanskrit stories, or contemporary stories about Gandhi and Nehru and our own life. They're all simultaneously present. So in today's child, or a today's student, or a today's faculty member cannot separate himself or herself from the past, cannot think in nationalistic terms, cannot think in regional terms. In a globally mixing economy, for example, my car was in an accident some time ago, and we gave it for repair. And our repairman here says that I can't do it for 2.5 months because the supply chain from China has stopped because the parts have to come from China. So we have become so interdependent. And of course, this is true of the economy. It's also true of culture. It's also true of education. It's also true of ideas. So the values that we are talking about are values that intermingle and interact. And I was lucky to have that kind of an exposure right from the very beginning when my father was telling us these stories. So I would like to continue. I was also lucky one day, for example. As I told you, he was a high school teacher. And the high school that I went to had 3,000 students. It's a huge school, even by Indian standards. And of course, very huge by American standards. And they were trying to select a team of speakers for an inter-high school debate. Okay? And the way they were trying to do it was by asking for an impromptu speech by children. And all of us were sitting there in lines, as you know. And the faculty the high school teachers were keeping order and discipline. And so was my father. My father made it a point never to take a class in which I was a student to avoid conflict of interest and so on. And so I was sitting in the back making some noise or talking to my friends and so on. So I see him suddenly next to me. I said, normally he avoids me. What's he doing here? So I said, I'm in trouble. So he says, come here. And he says, go and speak. And I was probably 11 or 12 years old. And I said, what, me? I'm not prepared. He said, nobody's prepared. It's an impromptu speech. So he made me go to the stage and talk to people. I don't remember what topic I talked about. And I was selected. And I had to go and take part in the debate. And then, of course, I took part in many other debates and so on. And today, when I look back on that one little action that he took, asking me to go and speak, made a big difference to my career as a public speaker. Because today I speak and I'm not nervous. I'm nervous in a general way because Professor Shastri is there and I'm afraid of him. But what I mean is, I don't have what they call stage fear. We can go and speak. And how does it come? It comes by practice. And how does it start? It starts by one person showing some confidence in you and saying, yes, you can do it. Go. and do it. Don't worry about it. Don't get nervous. If it doesn't matter if you fail, you can do it. Go ahead and do it. So that kind of, so I think one of the greatest gifts that a teacher can give you is that confidence, is to instill that confidence in you, to give you that courage, and to show that trust. And there will be other occasions that I will mention in a minute, which continue this. Let me continue just with a couple of more things about my teachers. And that is, I was a student in a high school, not even high school, middle school, in a small place called Kolar. It is a very poor area. And I had a teacher there whom I respected tremendously. His name was Maralappa or something like that. And he was always very well dressed, and he had a most beautiful handwriting on the blackboard. And to this day, I have modeled my handwriting on his handwriting. And people say that I have a good handwriting, and that's because of him. And he was an excellent teacher. And so I adored him. And I was supposed to be a good student. And so he was also very fond of me. One day he had to go to some meeting or something, and so he asked another student to be a monitor. And while the teacher was gone, of course, students make a lot of noise, as you know. And we were making a lot of noise, and we were teasing each other and all kinds of things, and what we thought was good fun. Unfortunately, what happened was our fun involved teasing a student who came from a very poor rural area, tribal area. And so his clothes were torn in those days. These days you don't see that too much, but. And he spoke a different dialect. And he didn't look very sophisticated. His hair was not oiled or shampooed or whatever. And we were making fun of him. And so when the teacher came back, the monitor reported to him that this is what these guys were doing. That's why there was so much noise. And he asked, who were these guys? So there were 3 of them, ringleaders. So they were asked to come to the front. And I was one of them. And my teacher asked me to hold out my hand. And he had in those days what we call rulers. These were pieces of wood beautifully smoothed so you can make lines on the paper, on the register. And they were very heavy wood. And using that as a stick, he raised it all the way high and brought it down on my hand so hard that I had never been beaten like that. And not once, but twice, 3 times. And he said, just because he is from a village, you think you are superior and you make fun of him? Let this be a lesson to you. And my God, I was in tremendous pain. But more importantly, humiliation. In front of the whole class, I was punished. And even more importantly, I was punished by my favorite teacher, whom I respected so much, and whose good opinion of me was very important to me. And it has left an impression on me that to this day I remember now, 55 years later or whatever. See, this is what I mean. An action by a teacher a particularly well-placed action which is appropriate to the time and to the circumstance can teach a value that can stay with you for the rest of your life. And since then, I have learned my lesson not to discriminate against anybody simply because they are different from me. I have learned to recognize the importance of difference of background, of value, and so on and so forth. So let me continue. So I still remember him, and I'm grateful to that teacher. Unfortunately, I don't know where he is, or he may not even be alive. But Sri Gurubhyo Namaha means him also. And on like that. Once I was in an essay, I was in a hostel. My father was in Shimoga. I came to Bangalore to study in Central College because I was interested in English. And I took part in an essay competition. And all of us got one little note, a kind of a reaction from the evaluator. And the evaluator was also a Professor Shastri. His name was Nanjundu Shastri. And he was teaching at Government Arts and Science College. And he was such a great scholar. I used to go to his classes from Central College to attend his classes, although he was not in my college. And he had written one note, very interesting, wields a facile style or something like that. That's all. 2 lines. But that gave me so much confidence, so much enthusiasm. I became an active debater and an essay writer. And similarly, when we were students, I had the opportunity to meet with a very great journalist in Bangalore. His name was Y.N. Krishnamurthy, YNK, everybody used to call him. He was editor of the most important Kannada newspaper at that time called Prajavani. And a bunch of students used to go and see him. And he would be busy, but he would make time to take us out for a cup of coffee and then talk to him. And he talked about everything. He talked about modern French literature of that time, Sartre, Camus, and Simone de Beauvoir, and all of those things. And the theater of the absurd, Eugene Ionesco, Samuel Beckett, all those things opened a whole world to us. Once again, what was more important was that he treated us almost as an equal. He would talk to us. We were students, college students, and he was a very senior, very highly respected person. He knew Girish Karnad, for example, and he knew all these people, Anantmurthy and all that, as personal friends, and in fact, they were his proteges. But still, he talked to us as if we were equal human beings. And that had a tremendous impact on us once again. And I was also, among my teachers, I would also like to include the faculty in the English department, a great writer called Lankesh, P. Lankesh. And another a friend of mine, a very close friend, who became a professor called Kiram Nagaraja, who was a very bright critic. And I learned a lot from him. So when I say teachers, I mean all kinds of people, journalists, and so on and so forth. But I would like to move on because I noticed that the time is passing. I would like to move on to some other very important influences in my life. And the most important of these was Professor Braj Kachru. His last name is written Kachru. He was a Kashmiri Pandit. He studied at Deccan College, Pune, University of Allahabad, and then taught at Lucknow, became a British Council scholar, did his PhD from the University of Edinburgh, and became a professor and chair of the Department of Linguistics at the University of Illinois. And then when rose to become the most important, he occupied the most prestigious academic position as the director of the Center for Advanced Study at the University of Illinois, which had so many Nobel laureates also as members. And he became the founder of a journal called World Englishes and president of the International Association of World Englishes. Very influential, very prolific scholar, many books and hundreds of articles. And I had the privilege to be his student. And I was at the University of Illinois when I met him. I had just given a talk and he had heard about it. So he was visiting there as on sabbatical. So he came there and we ran into each other in the stairways, and he called me to his office, and then he asked me, "What are your plans?" I said, "I want to do my PhD in Bangalore," because I was in Hyderabad. I had just finished my master's. And he said, "Have you considered going abroad?" I said, "No, I don't think I can afford it," because I thought in those days that you have to put your own money and go abroad. And I had not even thought about that. I thought it was for some big people, not for us. And then he said, "No, I don't think I would have a chance to go abroad." So he said, "What's special about?" And he took the names of some of the top people there, including the director of the institute where I was working, Dr. Ramesh Mohan. He was the vice chancellor of Meerut University later. And I said, he's taking my name in the same breath as these people. And then he said, "Why don't you apply?" And the next morning he gave me he had brought with him the application forms for his department. And he put it in my mailbox. He said, "Why don't you apply?" Look at what happened here. A small incident in which he recognized, for some reason, some sort of talent. But more importantly, he encouraged you by asking you, and also said that, "What's so special about them? Do they have horns?" he asked the other people who have gone abroad. Okay. So in other words, he was treating you like an equal with other people, telling you, instilling you confidence. And so I applied, and that year I didn't get an assistantship, but that only seemed to confirm my misgivings about myself. But next year I did get it. And I went there as a research assistant, and then I did my PhD and so on and so forth. The reason I mention him and his wife, who was also a professor, Yamuna Kachru, equally important scholar, highly respected, is that they have been my mentors. They have changed my life, and I owe everything to them. And with your permission, I would like to talk about them for the next few minutes. Professor Kachru was a voracious reader, and he taught us by example. So, being a student in his class meant that you learned not only the subject that he taught, but also how to be a teacher. He would always be punctual, never even 1 minute late. And he would take his teaching very seriously, always come prepared, never take it casually. And he always would have a handout in those days, cyclo-style handouts and so on. So you knew exactly what he was going to talk about, in what order, in what sequence, and what evidence he would use, and what further readings you had to do, and things like that. And he would explain things, and he would treat you with respect as a student if you had a question, all kinds of things like that. So a lot of good things about how to be an effective teacher I learned from him. But as you know, being a faculty member involves a lot of things. Teaching is only one of them. So teaching, research, service. So today in America, if a candidate has to receive tenure, has to be considered for tenure after 6 years, there is a very serious evaluation. That candidate is evaluated on all three of these criteria: teaching, research, service. Service to the university, service to your department, and service to the community. And through his personal example, he taught us to be good scholars. So, for example, he was always reading, always up to date on everything that was happening. And even if there was one small paper somebody had published somewhere in Poland, he would make sure that his library got it, and he would read it, and he would also share it with us to read it, and so on and so forth. And whenever he had to write a paper and he wrote so many papers, he would give it to us to comment. So we would correct it, So he would say, correct it. He would not say, just give us comment, but correct it. See if there are any problems. Look at the humility of a great scholar. And he would make sure that every little detail is perfectly taken care of. Every period, every comma, every punctuation, every capitalization, and every paragraphing, and everything, things like that. And all the references had to be perfect. You do not say anything unless it is supported by a reference. And all the data that you give, and of course in linguistics, as you know, as the great Indian grammarians used to say, ardhamatra laghavena putrotsavam manyate vyakaranaha. That means if you can reduce the length of a rule by half a syllable, ardhamatra, then the scholar is so happy as if he had gotten a son. Putrotsavam manyate vyakaranaha. So every detail, every length mark is important, a versus a. And that is indicated best by just one line on top of the vowel. And that was very important to him. And if there was that mistake, he would send it back to the printer to make sure that that is correctly done. So that kind of meticulous scholarship, complete documentation, and to make sure that there is not even the single slightest error, and even if it takes 10 times rewriting it, not skipping, no taking of shortcuts, that kind of scholarly integrity, he taught us by his personal example, and he encouraged us to do it. So, for example, even when I was a graduate student, he would say, there's a conference here, why don't you apply? Why don't you send an abstract? I said, there are all kinds of great people who are attending that scholarship. So what? What's wrong with you? So he treated you on par with the best scholars in the field and encouraged you to come up to that standard. He set high standards and expected you to rise to that standard, building confidence in you, showing by personal example with his conscientiousness. And he organized so many conferences, and he involved us, and he gave us credit. That's important. So he would say, organizing committee, and in that, along with other faculty members, the students who worked hard would also, their names would be there. And he would acknowledge it from the podium when people were in the conference was going on. And whenever scholars came to visit us, the top people in the field, he would introduce us to them. And he would invite us to his home to meet with them and provide for a little time for us to spend with that scholar individually, talking about our work and things like that. So there was no barrier between personal life and professional life for such scholars. And they set high standards and they made sure that we rose up to them. The most important thing that we learned from them was how to be a professional, to be a scholar, to be a teacher, and that dedication to the department, the dedication to the university, and so I learned a lot about how to edit books from him, and also even to talk to other people, how to talk politely, how to use humor to overcome difficult situations, and so on and so forth. And all this was done by encouragement, not by punishment. You knew that you did what you had to do, not out of fear that he would do something, but because you did not want to disappoint him, because his standards were high. And there was no small-mindedness. He would give you credit and he would encourage you, write wonderful letters of recommendation, and so on and so forth. So this relationship between a guru and a shishya was a very unique thing. And this was in the best tradition of Guru Shishya Parampara that we have in India, and we have also around the world. There is nothing unique about India on this, although it's very important in India. And one other thing I learned from him was how do I put it? The importance of standing up for your values. Okay? To take no nonsense from anybody else. If somebody insulted you, or if somebody spoke casually about you, or about your tradition, or about India, for example, or did not treat you with the same respect as would be due to anybody else, he would become a lion. He would make sure that the Indian experience was as valid, treated as valid as anybody else. For example, I'll give you just one example, two examples. English, right? When you think about it, American English is only as old as Indian English. English has been in India since 1600 and certainly since 1757. And when you look at the number of people who know English in India, there are more people who use English in India than in America. So India is the largest English language using country in the world. Okay. And when you look around, English changes. English is different in America, it's different in England, it's different in Australia, it's different in New Zealand, and it's different in Africa, in India, and so on and so forth. So why is it different? Of course, because it's a second language to us, so our first language influences us. So we have Hindi English, Punjabi English, Marathi English, Bengali English, and so on. This is inevitable. And secondly, it is also different because we use English not to talk to Englishmen or Americans, but among ourselves. Like today, I'm talking to you in English, not because there are Americans here in this meeting, but that is the common language that we all have, a language of education. right? And the English language is used in India to express Indian experience. And Indian experience is different from British experience or American experience. And therefore, it is natural that the English language should change in India and that we should use Indian English and not British English. If somebody came to Bhopal and spoke British English to everybody, they would be a laughing stock. People will say, hey, well, who are you going to impress? Are you trying to show off? Or if they spoke an American Midwestern English. So in India, we use Indian English. But the traditional establishment theory was that there is only one correct English, and that is the native speaker's English. That is the way in which the British people speak, or the way in which Americans speak. And his point was, why? Language changes according to circumstances. And it's perfectly natural that the English language should change when it is used for 200 years in India to express Indian situations and culture and society. So Indian English is as valid a dialect of English as American English. And so he started a whole movement. Journals, conferences, textbooks, reference works, on and on and on. And so for 40 years, he worked on this. So that eventually even the best people, the president of the British Academy, for example, the president of the Teachers of English to Speakers of Other Languages in America, for example, and presidents of Linguistic Society of America, for example, all of them came to recognize the validity of his points and respected him. And so today, he is considered to be one of the greatest authorities on the English language around the world. In all the countries, you talk to people who are teachers of English and scholars who have worked on English, on the history of the English language, his name is mentioned as the most influential one, Braj Kachru, an Indian. And the reason is because he refused to compromise on integrity, on values. He talked about the validity of his experience as valid as any other experience. So if we can talk about other dialects with respect, why should we be ashamed of our own dialect? And as I said, India has the largest number of English speakers in the world today. And India is the second or third largest publisher of books in English in the world today. And on like that. So I think I should start winding down now. The reason I mentioned all of these things is because a teacher can make a difference. A teacher, by his or her personal example, can mold the life of a person, not simply the academic career of a person, but their values as human beings, how we relate to the world, how we relate to what values we learn, and so on. So I will, on that point, I'll just mention one other thing and conclude. In conclusion, I would also consider India to be my teacher, and I would consider America to be my teacher. Having lived here for 50 years, I have learned a lot from America. And one of the most interesting things that I have learned is how the university functions, how they care, how some values and institutions have been built up here, how scholarship is very important, and how tenure is taken so seriously, and how quality is considered central. So, in giving promotion to somebody, in giving permanent job to somebody, in giving an increment to somebody, people look at quality. Quality is measured it's taken very seriously. So they have come up with a series of how to measure quality in terms of research, in terms of research productivity, the impact of the research on the field, and things are like that, a whole series of values. For example, when a grant is evaluated, grant application is evaluated, how do you go about evaluating it? Who do you ask to evaluate it? And how do you select the people who will evaluate it? And what do you look for? And so I'm not saying that there is no nepotism or there is no corruption in terms of finance, but all of that is very minor. The central point in all the good universities is quality. And they look for, and they have devised mechanisms to judge quality. So, for example, if somebody comes up for tenure and they are judged on, as I said, research, teaching, and service, I will talk only about research for a minute. So, where have you published? How much have you published? How consistently have you published? What is the quality of the journals in which you have published? How do you determine the quality? So, for example, who is the publisher of this journal? How often is it published? What kind of people publish in it? Who are the best people in your field, in your particular area, whether it is thermodynamics or whether it is sociology of inequality, whatever. And you ask them. So if the expert on this is in Switzerland or in Japan or in Australia, you ask them to evaluate what is the quality of this person who is coming up for tenure. Has she been productive? Has he been influential? Do you know that person? How would you compare that to other people at the same stage of his or her career? And how would you talk about it? And so on. So I could go on and on about it. This is a huge topic, but I just wanted to mention it because when we are talking about teachers, institutions are also teachers. The institutions the reason America is important and influential around the world is many reasons: foreign policy, military, and economics, and so on. But one of the most important is culture and education. And in the field of education and culture, America and Western countries have come up with institutions for managing quality. And I think we have a lot to learn from them. And so they would also be our teachers, and we should also say Gurubhyo Namaha in that sense as well. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to go on and on like this. Too long I have gone on, but I've enjoyed it, and I would really like to leave some time for us for discussion. And so thanks again.
Thank you very much, sir. It was packed with tons of insights, and the kind of questions that have come up in the chat are a testimony to the fact that a lot of thoughts have been stirred. So the first question that I want to put forth for you is by a colleague of mine, Dr. Naveen Bisla, and she says that thank you for such a beautiful beginning to begin with. And her question is that in Ramayan, we see that Ram's greatness is a result of his choices, where he chose to put dharma before his personal interests. Likewise, in the case of Ravan, he also had a lot of noble characteristics, but then he chose a life of evil. So, what she's trying to ask here is that do you think that being good or bad is entirely a matter of a person's personal choice? Or do teachers have a huge influence in this decision making process for a person?
Excellent question. In fact, it deserves a detailed discussion, but quickly, I would say it's not simply a matter of personal choice, but it is a matter of personal choice. So, how do we choose to live? It has to do with what we have been exposed to, what we have been taught, and the people whom we consider to be our peers or our reference group, or the people whom we should imitate or whom we should follow. So everybody follows a reference group. So we have, let us say, we should be like them. And he has done it or she has done it, and therefore I can do it or I should do it. So, in other words, examples are very important. That's why people like Rama and the Pandavas are good examples. Of course, even they have some problems, as you know. Rama's treatment of Sita was not the best thing. But you see, the larger picture in terms of which that is judged. So we make choices, but our choices are based on our experiences, and our experiences include our teachers, and the teachers set can set the reference group.
Right, sir. Sir, the next question is from another colleague of mine, Nupur, and she says that listening to you made me think of APJ Abdul Kalam, who said that a good student could learn from a bad teacher and that a poor student from even a skilled teacher. What are your
Right.
views on this? And does learning really depend on the skills of the teacher or on the ability of the student to critically analyze and grasp?
I would say it's a combination of the two. Good teachers are important. So if you are stuck with bad teachers, then you don't learn anything. For example, um, when I was a student, the uh, profession of choice would have been to become a doctor or an engineer. Those were the only two things that everybody talked about when I was a student. And so everybody chose PCM or PCB, that is physics, chemistry, mathematics, or physics, chemistry, biology. Those were the two choices. But my teachers in certain fields were not that great. And so I did not go into the sciences. And but although linguistics later I learned was as much a science as anything else. But so having the right kind of teacher pushes you in a particular direction. But it's certainly true that if you have a student with a critical mind, they can learn in spite of a bad teacher. That is true. But usually it's a combination of the two.
Thank you very much, sir. Another question from Mr. Sandeep Surange. How do you see Chanakya as a teacher? He had the ability to transform and make a very lasting impact on an ordinary person. We don't really see teachers like him anymore, he says. Do you think the quality has gone down or diluted?
No, I would not. So actually, you should ask this question of Professor Sandeep Shastri because he is the expert on political strategy. And he has talked very greatly, in great detail, about political strategy in different states of India as well as on the national level. And so one could have a whole seminar on this. But again, very briefly, I have great respect for Chanakya. And Chanakya, and for many reasons. One is that not only did he talk with great insight about all kinds of things, but he was also an extremely practical man. So he realized that not only is it important for you to have the right ethical values and things like that, but more importantly, you also need to have power. And if you do not have power, all your values come to nothing. And so the world is full of people, good people who are suffering. Why? Is because they only concentrated on values, but not how to bring about these values, how to make these things succeed. And so uh, Chanakya talked about interstate relationships and how the head of state has to maintain his power, has to acquire his power, has to safeguard his power, has to take care of the rivals and things like that. So there are many great things that we can learn, but he was only one of the many great teachers that India has had. And I know today lots and lots of wonderful teachers who could be, as good as Chanakya. But I would not agree that we don't have such teachers anymore. We just have to discover them.
Right, sir. Thank you very much. Uh, I have two more questions here, and both of them are kind of in the same vein, so I'll club them together. A colleague called Ipshita and Suman, both of them have pointed out that in today's digital world, it's very easy for students to access information online, which in a way, directly affects their response in classes, because they have this easy accessibility to all that they can Google about. The lectures
Yes.
and the in-class experience kind of faces a huge challenge. How do you think a teacher can tackle such a scenario?
Yes, I have experienced this myself, and so I teach graduate courses as well as undergraduate courses. And so what I do is to make Google a partner. So I ask them to actually go to Google and find out. So let us say I have to say something about some particular language like Billy, let's say in India. So I will say, check it out. Or I say something about it and then I deliberately ask them to go and check it out and find out more. So I use the internet as a supplement and as a helper in my teaching and not as a threat. So I will say that, okay, if I'm wrong, just let me know. That's all. So it may be that I got some figure wrong about how many speakers there are, or how many dialects there are, or what the status when it was recognized and things like that. I say, check it out and let me know. I stand corrected. So by not setting myself up as the only authority, but rather as one of the many things that they can go to find out facts, I kind of disarm them. And so, and also, whether I like it or not, they will look at Google. Whether I like it or not, they are looking at social media and things like that. And so, why not make it part of the learning experience? And so, get everybody to do it. Why not?
Right, sir. Moving on, I have a question from Kirti, but I'm going to take that at the end, Kirti. I would want to do Apurva's question first so that it kind of logically continues in the discussion. So she's saying, good evening, sir. It has been a highly enriching session for all of us. The attitude of students towards teachers and classmates is very different, for obvious reasons. They treat their teachers differently and their classmates differently. The quotient of respect has also kind of changed over time. We've considered respect in a different definition now, and a lot of times students don't really warm up towards a teacher who's not taught them, or they kind of tend to compare. How do you think a teacher should be behaving in such a situation?
That's a very difficult question because I know exactly what you're talking about. There have been many cases that I have come to know where teachers are not respected. And sometimes, when their ideas they go against the beliefs of people, they have been punished and they have been even, their hands have been cut off and things like that. And so it's not an easy uh, topic about which I can give a flippant answer. So the teacher has to be careful. The teacher has to tread a fine line, but at the same time not sacrifice his or her integrity. And so I would say the only way to do this um, is to co-opt the students. So usually, in my own experience and that of others, students do respect teachers who are themselves good scholars, moral people, upstanding people. And so uh, th- there may be cases of indiscipline and so on, but the other students themselves will act as a check on the unruly students. And so it's only by example and by personally talking to people that you have to win their hands and win their hearts and minds. And it cannot be something that is done by force. So as they say, respect is something that you cannot demand it, but you have to command it by your experience.
Sir, moving on to Kirti's question, she wants to know, have you ever come across a thing, encountered something when you were learning, which you decided you will never do when you become a teacher?
Yeah, I'm sure there were many, but I have to. It's a. I can't think of examples right away, but yeah, one thing that um, I would think about is that I would not want to bore my students. So the one thing that I would not like to do is to bore them. So one has to be very careful to judge people's reactions. You can tell when you are boring, when you are going on and on and on and they are not responding to it. So you have to change your strategy, and instead of even if you had on your lesson plan uh, all kinds of things about what you are going to talk about, if it's not resonating with your students, you have to change the topic, do something else, introduce some humor, and so on and so forth. So one thing that I would not do is to bore my students. And other things like insisting that I am the only correct one, or humiliate students in public, or correct them in a very um, harsh fashion. What I do is, let's say, for example, sometimes students would ask questions which are not particularly relevant. So turn that around to the topic that you are talking about. So there are ways in which you can interpret. You just give them a little bit of a recognition that, okay, I like the fact that you asked this question, and this question can be framed like this, and then reinterpret it to continue with the kinds of things that you are doing. But most important of all, I think, is that you have to create an atmosphere in the class in which the students feel they can talk freely to you and to each other and to respect you, and that their views are respected, their experience is respected. It's not that they are not dismissed offhand as irrelevant. So I think that's a nice thing about American system also, that that students' questions are taken seriously and answered.
Right, sir. Very, very pertinent points, sir. Uh, I would request my colleagues, if there's any other question, you could go ahead, unmute yourself and ask. And while you do that, I would want to put up a question to you, sir. Uh,
Sure.
when we teach concepts to students, or we kind of guise them as stories and want them to make sense to students, what do you think really makes it stick with them? How do we as teachers ensure that this learning goes with them out of the classroom and kind of stays with them for the better part of their lives?
Yeah, again, very good question, and lots of time is needed to answer it. But quick answer would be to say examples. What stays with people is examples. These long concepts and detailed things are good, but what they remember after a few years is maybe a joke you told them, a particular anecdote that you talked about, and especially some personal thing that you brought in, maybe something that happened to you at breakfast that morning, or with your wife, or with your friends and another student, and so on and so forth. Making a concept, illustrating a concept with a personal anecdote or a situation that they can identify with, something that is very pertinent, that, for example, something from that morning's newspaper, something like that. I think that will make them, it will stick in their minds more than just an abstract presentation. I would always try to make things concrete with uh, experience, relating it to experience.
Right, sir. It's actually very important for a teacher to connect the dots and kind of demonstrate it so that a student understands that, all things are related.
Yes, exactly. Right, right. So I think that's a very important point that you just made, to show that all things are related. So, for example, that there is no dichotomy between the humanities and the social sciences, between the natural sciences and business, from between music and politics and things like that. All of those things, there are ways to relate things, and each one has a place in the world. There are some people who are good musicians but bad politicians, some people who are terrible politicians, but still you can learn something from them, and so on and so forth. So, bringing all things together in a holistic perspective, in particular, because we are talking about cross cultural things, I think we should not be ashamed to and not be self conscious about bringing in Indian things in talking about world theories. Theories about law, about social justice, about women or men or religion or politics or whatever. Things should be integrated, and things should be related to one another, and that's a wonderful thing.
Right, sir. Uh, would anybody like to unmute themselves and ask a question or share some thoughts or observations? Sir, you started by sharing your journey when it began in India, and you'd mentioned this thing when you kind of started the session that you've crossed cultures and reached where you are. How difficult or challenging this journey has been for you?
Oh, very difficult, actually. I would not minimize that, because everything was difficult when you first come to this country. Especially, these days things are different, but I came here for the first time in 1973, almost 50 years ago. And there were not that many people who used to come, and so we didn't know much about America. See, nowadays there is so much American movies, which are series, which you see on television and so on. So people are almost familiar as if it was their own. But in those days, it was difficult. So you didn't know how many forks you are supposed to use, and what you eat for breakfast, and how you approach somebody, how you address somebody. So, for example, the word guy at one time, when I was a student, referred only to boys, not to girls. Okay. So now everybody says, "Hey, you guys," right? So things have changed. And like that, there can be 100 little things that could be challenging. But the only way you can do this is by being aware, being sensitive, by asking, and not be self-conscious. That's another thing. In my experience, people are helpful, people are kind, people are good. And so I would start with that premise. So if I have a problem, I can go and ask somebody. And, let's say you are sitting at a table and then there are 6 spoons there and you don't know which one to use for what. Just ask the next door person, or person sitting next to you. Hey, there are so many spoons here. What do I do? They don't mind. They also understand that these are new, these are different. So sometimes just a simple, straightforward communication and self-deprecation, making yourself a butt of jokes, that's fine. That makes life, that reduces the distance and also makes things easier.